Hello children, let's quickly start our today's EVS1 period with a wonderful thought. Your mistakes are a proof that you are trying. So if you are doing mistakes, don't get afraid. Your mistakes shows that you are still trying. You are doing your best. Okay, so never afraid of your mistakes. Keep trying. Keep trying. So today we are going to start with lesson number 4, which is environmental balance. Okay, you know very well what is environment, isn't it? But how this whole balance in the environment is maintained, that we are going to learn in today's lesson. So let's quickly continue. Huh. The first point which we have to learn in today's lesson is about biodiversity, children. Okay. See, the meaning of this word bio is what? Living things. And diversity is what, children? Variety. Okay. So bio is living things and diversity is what? Is what? Variety. So the variety in all the living things belonging to a particular area is called biodiversity. In that particular area, like in the last lesson, we saw one example, kangaroo is the speciality of what, children? Australia, in that particular area, isn't it? That is the variety of that particular place. So this is nothing but the biodiversity. Cactus, especially we see in the desert areas, so that is the speciality of that particular place, isn't it? So this is nothing but the biodiversity. Living things, bio, living things, and diversity means variety. So the variety in all the living things, whether it could be plants and animals belonging to a particular area, is called biodiversity. Let's study something about the environment. Environment, nature, you already know. Environment is mainly consist of what, children? Animals and plants. But along with animals and plants, you also see certain non-living things in the environment. What are those non-living things? You also see sunlight, air, water, soil. Isn't it? This is a part of environment. This is a part of nature. So all these things together make our environment. Let's read out what is written in our today's slide. The animals and plants in particular surroundings in particular area, and the non-living components, non-living things, such as what? Sunlight, air, water, soil, it together makes the environment. So living and non-living things are basically dependent on each other. See, we are dependent on water, even we are dependent on animals for many of our needs, isn't it? We get milk from animals, we get food from plants. So living and non-living things are dependent on each other, isn't it? So water is a non-living thing, but still all animals along with human beings need water. So this is how living and non-living things are dependent on each other. Huh. The next thing which we have to study in lesson is what, children? Food chain. Now what is food chain? You might have heard about many chains, but what is this food chain? See, when one living thing is food for another living thing, when one animal is food for another animal, so this is called a food chain. See, living things dependent upon each other for food and feeding is called a food chain. Okay, but remember one thing, every food chain will always start with plant. Plant is the basic thing, plant is the main thing with which this food chain will start. See, in this picture it's very clear. See, plants, and you know very well plants make their own food, isn't it? We don't give food to the plants, they make their own food with the help of sunlight, water, isn't it? So plants, they are the first part of food chain. In this example, you will see on these plants or on the leaves, the grasshopper is going to feed. On the same grasshopper, frog is going to feed. So grasshopper is food for frog. On the same frog, snakes, they feed, isn't it? Frog, favorite food of snakes, isn't it? So frog is a food for snake. This is called a food chain. Okay, so this food chain has started with plants. All food chains are going to start with the plants. So plants, basically they are the main thing to start with the food chain. So when one living thing is food for another, or when living things are dependent on each other for the purpose of food and feeding, that is nothing but the food chain. See, if there are no plants, no grasshoppers. If there are no grasshoppers, no frogs. If there are no frogs, snakes cannot survive, isn't it? So one living thing is dependent on each other, isn't it, for the purpose of food. That is called food chain. Okay, understood what is food chain? See, we will again read it out. Living things dependent upon each other for food and feeding is called a food chain. See how here on plants, grasshopper is dependent. On grasshopper, frog is dependent. On frog, snake is dependent. So one living thing is food for another living thing. This is called a food chain. Okay, this thing is clear, I think, to all of you. Huh. Next part of this food chain is the food web. Now what is the meaning of web? Web, you know very well, children. Spider, they make the web. In Marathi we say जाळं, कोळ्याचं जाळं, isn't it? So that is the web. But here we are talking about the food web. So when different animals, they are connected to each other, they form a deep web. that is called a food web. See, all these animals, somehow they are connected to each other and they form a web like thing, isn't it? So that is called a food web. See here, when different food chains are combined together, they form a food web. See, in the previous slide, what we saw is just one food chain, isn't it? So many such food chains, when they are joined to each other, when they are connected to each other, they form a food web. See here, you can see here, all so many different food chains, so many different animals are deeply connected to each other. This is called a food web. See here, plants, the main thing on which the food chain or food web will start. On the same plants, many different animals are going to feed. Like here, small animals, birds, these frogs, because snails are there, so frogs are going to feed. Caterpillar, then deer, isn't it? And on all these animals, all these different animals are going to feed, isn't it? Like lizard is there, some big birds are there, rabbits, isn't it? Rabbits are going to feed on the plants, isn't it? So this is a food web. On all these animals again, these animals are going to feed, isn't it? Like all these different animals, they are going to, like lion, tigers, they are going to feed on these animals, isn't it? So this is a food web. Okay, see here, this is there is not only one food chain, isn't it? There are so many different animals, different food chains, they are attached and joined, combined to each other. This is nothing but the food web. Did you understood the difference between food chain and food web? Food chain, only one single food chain, but food web, when different food chains are joined to each other, connected to each other, they form a food web. So when different food chains are combined together, they form a food web. Okay. So when different food chains are combined together, they form a food web. See, deep web is there, no? Different, so many different animals. They are deeply connected to each other. If there are no plants, these animals won't be able to survive. On these animals, see, these animals are going to feed. So all these animals, they are deeply somehow connected to each other. So this is the food web. Huh. Huh. Then the very important part of the lesson, that is environmental balance. But how this whole balance is maintained in the nature between living and non-living things. Let's see, environmental balance. Okay, due to various food chains, all living things get their own food. See, if there are no food chains, animals won't get their food. See, if there are no plants, there won't be other animals which feed on plants, isn't it? So due to all these food chains, all living things gets their own food. Huh. Then what happens when these animals they die? Their dead remains, what happens to those dead remains, isn't it? So nature takes care of those dead remains. How? Microorganisms. What are microorganisms, children? Germs which are not visible to our eyes, but they are present in the air, in water and soil, isn't it? So these germs or microorganisms, what they do, children, they bring about the decomposition. Now what is this decomposition? It is nothing but the breakdown. They convert these dead remains of animals and plants in the soil. And what they convert those dead remains? They convert those dead remains into nutritive substances for plants, like fertilizers. Now what are fertilizers and what is nutritive substances? Like for our human body, which are the nutritive substances? Like vitamins, proteins, these are the nutritive substances which are useful for the growth of our body. So likewise, fertilizers are the nutrients which are important for the growth of plants. But how these fertilizers are formed? From the dead remains of plants and animals in the soil. Okay, so along with that, some important cycles are also there in the nature. Water cycle, you know very well, in the last lesson we studied something about the water cycle. Remember, evaporation, condensation, isn't it? So this continuous water cycle is going on in the nature, and because of this water cycle, every living thing on the earth gets the water, isn't it? See, water cycle gives water to all the living things. Along with that, oxygen and carbon dioxide cycle is also there. Now what is this? You know very well, animals takes oxygen and give out carbon dioxide, which is used by the plants for their food. You know very well, animals they breathe, and while breathing what they do, they take oxygen and they give out carbon dioxide. But this carbon dioxide is very useful for the plants, because with the help of this carbon dioxide they make their own food. And you know very well how plants are important for us. Plant is the food for us, it is the food for animals. Because of this continuous interaction, this continuous, somehow we can say they are connected, joined to each other. Interaction is what, children? Connected. So this continuous interaction between living and non-living things, environmental balance is maintained. So because of this continuous interaction, see water cycle, formation of water, oxygen and carbon dioxide, this is a part of non-living components. But all animals and plants, these are the living components. But all these living and non-living things, they are deeply connected to each other, they are dependent on each other, and because of this continuous interaction, environmental balance is maintained. So if there are no plants, environmental balance won't be maintained. If there are no animals, again balance won't be maintained. If there are no non-living things like water, air, soil, then also this balance won't be able to maintain. There has to be continuous interaction. These living and non-living things has to be connected with each other to maintain this whole balance. Okay, like here we saw, isn't it? See, all living things get their own food because of food chain. So if there are no food chains, no animals. If there are no animals, there are no plants, because you know very well, when these animals they die, they convert these microorganisms, they convert these dead remains of animals and plants into useful fertilizers, which is very useful for the growth of plants. So if there are no animals, there are no plants. If there are no plants, there are no animals. And if there are no non-living things like air, water and soil, plants and animals won't be able to survive at all. So all these things has to be connected to each other, has to be together to maintain the whole balance in the nature. Okay, but for that you also need some important cycles, that is water cycle, oxygen and carbon dioxide cycle. Okay, did you understood how this whole balance in the nature or environment is maintained? Okay, so today we saw some of the important points. We started something with food chain. What about the food chain, children? Let's quickly see. Food chain: when one living thing is dependent upon another living thing for the purpose of feeding. When one animal is food for another animal, it is nothing but the food chain. So when such different food chains are deeply connected to each other, they form a food web. Environmental balance: for environmental balance you need all the living and non-living things together, then only this balance would be maintained. Like because of food chains, living things gets the food, and when these living things, that is whether it is plants and animals, they die, their dead remains get converted into useful fertilizers with the help of these microorganisms, and these fertilizers are very useful for the growth of plants. Along with that, some important cycles are also there in the nature: water cycle and carbon dioxide cycle and oxygen cycle. Okay, these things are also very important, because without these important cycles, again animals and plants won't be able to survive at all, isn't it? And because of this continuous interaction or connection between living and non-living things, environmental balance is maintained. So what is your today's homework, children? You have to write down all the points which we learn in today's period in your notebook without fail. All the points which we saw just now in all the slides, I want all those points in your notebook without fail. Okay, so that's all for your today's period. We will again meet in the next period.